Hello, this is Russ Galvin, Colorado Crane Operator School. I want to continue with our series of roles and responsibilities of those individuals that are involved in the hoisting operations. And today I want to go ahead and talk to you a little bit more about the operators' roles and their responsibilities for hoisting operations. And I'll say this, when it really comes down to it, they have the most responsibility, and rightfully so. I mean, they are the qualified, the skilled individual on the job, where it is solely up to them to make sure that job or that load, is lifted in a smooth, controlled manner. I mean, it cannot be done without the operator, plain and simple. So they're going to have the most roles and responsibilities. So let's start breaking these things down one at a time and continue through this process. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is they need to review the requirements of the lift plan for that particular lift with the lift director before they start those lifting operations, which basically means which also includes that load weight and the radius for that particular lift is already been given to them from the lift director. Now, if there's consecutive lifts, once again, all the information is given to them up front through the entire process. They also need to know the site conditions and how they could adversely affect the crane operations. And that's going to be ground, that's going to be power lines, that's going to be other known obstructions. So let's talk about ground, talk about soil pressure, all those things will definitely affect the crane operations. They also need to understand all the information that is in the operator's manual and making sure that operator manual maintains in the operator's cab of that particular crane so they can always use it back for reference. But they need to have fully read and understood all the information within the operator's manual, right? And of course, apply all the necessary components as necessary. They also need to understand the crane's particular functions. Take the crane each day. They need to take the crane through each one of its functions, and that's part of the daily inspection process. But they need to understand all the crane's functions and all their characteristics and limitations for that particular crane. They do need to understand the load capacity charts, how to determine net capacity for that particular crane and that particular lift. They need to know the load capacity charts for each different configuration for the lift that they are going to be commencing. So if they're going to be doing, lifts on tires, they need to know the load charts and they understand the limitations of those load charts on tires, and then understand once you put it on, say, mid-extension of outriggers, full extension of outriggers, the different combinations. And they have the ability to refuse to operate the crane when they get around the power lines. And just kind of a recap, once again, it's as a general rule, if it's 350 kilovolts or less, you're going to be 20 feet away. If it's more than 350 kilovolts, you're going to maintain 50 feet away. But you do have, once again, there are procedures that allow you to work a little bit closer, but you need to make sure as an operator you're following those procedures, all right? And you're not letting a site supervisor or someone else trying to tell you, oh, it's going to be okay. They definitely have the ability to stop all crane operations. It is also the operator's job to perform daily inspection procedures, and this is all part of, their certification. But daily inspection is going to be consistent with control mechanisms, tires, as the glass clear. You can see from there all the crane going through all of its functions properly. As a hydraulic system, we have any excessive fluid, electrical wiring. We inspect all those. So in operational aids, all those things need to be functioning properly, and they document all that as according to their daily inspections. And then they need to promptly report any maladjustments to the qualified individuals to determine if the crane needs to be taken out of service or not. With that being said, they need to follow all lockout tagout procedures for that particular crane. So if the crane has two winch drums and for whatever reason the wire rope on that auxiliary drum can no longer be used, then they need to follow the lockout tagout procedures not to use that second auxiliary drum. All right. And the other thing too is they do not operate the crane when they're physically and mentally unfit. I mean, it's, if you're having an off day and something's going on, it is that operator's responsibility to let the lift director know, and the individual in charge of lifting operations say, they're just not able to perform that lift today. They're just not there because, you got a lot of, heavy loads on the line, a lot of lives around you. So if you're physically and mentally unfit to operate that crane, you need to communicate that with the appropriate individual. And then all the controls, when you're running those controls, they should be able to return back to neutral. So if I'm running, pulling on the back of little rabbit ears, a little Grove, and I let go one of those controls, it should return back to neutral. I shouldn't have to force that control back to its neutral position. So every one of those controls return back to neutral. Don't engage in any practice that will divert your attention, otherwise known as a cell phone, or watching YouTube videos during crane operations. And unfortunately, I wouldn't say those are common things, but I have seen operators do two things at once, communicate on the phone while they're trying to run the crane. So it is your responsibility to be fully engaged in what you are doing in the hoisting operations. It's obviously your role and responsibility to test all the crane functions every day. That's me: boom up, boom down, swing, hoist, telescope in, telescope out. Whatever the crane functions you're going to be using for that particular day, it's your job to test those functions, and then do not operate the crane if the crane is not responding appropriately to those functions. All right, and then when you're operating those functions, you need to operate those functions in a smooth and controlled manner. Meaning what that does is going to reduce the drift, reduce shock loading, ease in and out of each control appropriately, so you're able to maintain proper load control. And of course, it's much smoother on that crane. It's not nearly, you're less likely to damage the crane when you're operating the crane in a smooth, controlled manner. And if you ever look at the word smooth and controlled, I promise you it's written in the owner's manual a handful of times. And that is something the operator needs to have already read as well. They need to know the ins and outs of that manual, and that manual needs to be with the crane inside the operator's cabs at all times. So it's that operator's responsibility to know that operator's manual and to have it with them at all times. They do need to know the assembly, disassembly procedures for that particular crane, and work with that qualified individual that's in charge of all assembly, disassembly, if it is not the crane operator. But they do need to know those procedures for the crane. They do know how to travel the crane, or in and around the job site. That doesn't necessarily mean they need to have a CDL going from point A to point B over the road, but once that crane is on site, it is their responsibility to move that crane as necessary from within the project on where they need to be. They also need to observe each outrigger during extension and retraction. If they can't observe each outrigger for whatever reason, then they need to get a signal person to help communicate them. And what that is designed so that way, one, you're not going to put someone in a pinch point or damage a crane by accidentally extending the outrigger into something, but also make sure your crane the outriggers are fully extended or fully retracted in accordance, or mid, wherever you need to, whatever the configuration needs to be, but you need to make sure that you are observing extension and retraction of each outrigger. And I think once we mentioned before, but ensure the load weight, is within the crane's operating capacity in respect to the radius of where that load, is going to be placed. So it is your job to understand the load charts and understand how that all works. We mentioned before. Mention again that you understand how to calculate net capacity, and that's you take your gross load minus all your deductions, and that will give you net capacity. So that tells you what's the most you can pick at that particular radius. You need to understand all factors that affect capacity, and what that's going to do, and understand where, certain wind values you need to reduce your load chart by certain percentages. But all that information is in the owner's manual as an operator for you to determine that information. Also, as an operator, you need to know hand signals and appropriate voice signals, and understand the communication of those. And then if any kind of special signal is going to be used by that signal person, you, the lift director, and the signal person need to agree upon each one of those. And then you also need to understand basic load rigging procedures. Now, a certified operator is not necessarily a qualified rigger, but a certified operator does need to know basic rigging procedures. So it is my belief that every operator should be at least a qualified rigger, but you don't have to be that, but you do need to know, basic rigging procedures, because at the end of the day, that load needs to be handled in a smooth, controlled fashion, and you need to be able to recognize of how something is currently rigged. If it may not, you don't want that load to shift or have a loss of load event. And then as you continue to go through this, if power fails on your crane for whatever reason, you need to set all brakes and all locking devices, and then of course ensure all controls and clutches are all in the neutral position, and try to land any hook, if practical, land anything that's suspended from the hook before the end of the workday, before leaving that crane. And then finally, before leaving the crane, apply all lockout, tag out procedures, ensure the crane and controls on the off, neutral position, make sure your crane is secured at night according to the manufacturer's procedures. So, these are just a handful of basic operator responsibilities. Once again, each job site, each company can add a few more responsibilities onto that operator. But keep in mind that operator is in charge of those lifting, is in charge of the crane. So if they see any kind of dangerous, lifting operations going on, they have the right to refuse operations until those situations, or I should say conditions, are addressed. So once again, my name is Russ Galvin, Colorado Crane Operator School, and I appreciate you watching the video. Have a great day.